The word would has a lot of uses in English and can be difficult to master. To make things easier, let's say there are three major categories: using would to talk about the past, using would in a hypothetical or conditional situation, or using would to be more polite. Now, as with most things in English, there's a few exceptions that don't fit perfectly into these categories, so we'll call them miscellaneous for now and look at them in a little bit. Would in the past can be found in sentences like, I wouldn't leave, where we're expressing someone's refusal to do something in the past. A hypothetical situation might be one like, that'd be great, where we're using would as a contraction to say how this possible thing might be. And of course, a more polite way to give someone advice could be, I would say hi, instead of telling someone, say hi, as a command. Let's explore these uses in more detail. One of the simplest uses of would to talk about the past is when it is used in the same way as used to describe something that happened regularly. For example, I would always sneak downstairs for a midnight snack. This means that, in the past, I used to sneak downstairs for a snack regularly. Another way we use would in the past is to talk about the future from the perspective of the past. How would you say that your boss was aware that his team was going to be late? The boss knew the team would be late. This is the past tense version of saying the boss knows the team will be late. Now let's say a year ago you said to your friend, I think I will be fluent by next year. Now that it is next year, how would you explain that this is what you were thinking in the past? I thought I'd be fluent by now. Another way we use would in the past is to talk about someone refusing something. Here's an example. If Lauren refused to tell you what was wrong, you could say, Lauren wouldn't tell me what was wrong. Sometimes things refuse stuff too, not just people. How would you say that despite trying a lot of things, the oven refused to work? No matter what he tried, the oven wouldn't work. The last past usage is when we use would to talk about guesses about things that happened recently, that you're pretty confident in. For example, if you ordered pizza and somebody just used the doorbell, how might this conversation look? Who just rang the doorbell? That would be the pizza guy. Or if you just saw a friend walking with someone who you are pretty sure is their boyfriend, how would you respond to this question? Who was walking with her just now? That would be her new boyfriend. One category down, two to go. In this next case, we're looking at situations that involve some sort of condition, preference, hypothetical situation, or wish. The easiest one to use here is would rather, which is how we express our preference between a few alternatives. How would you say that you prefer to study English instead of Spanish? I would rather study English than Spanish. Notice that we use the word than when we specify the thing we are comparing our preference to. On the other hand, what if somebody asked for your phone number and you have absolutely no interest in sharing it? Can I have your phone number? I would rather die. The alternative here is implied. I would rather die than give it to you. You can also use would rather in a question to find out somebody's preference. How would you use it here? Would you rather cook or go out to eat? Notice that when we use would in a question, the subject and would switch places. How might you answer this question using the same structure? I would rather cook than go out to eat. Another super common place that would shows up is in conditions with if. This could be a condition that may happen, or one that didn't or won't, and we're imagining the outcome. For example, let's say you live in New York and your friend lives in California. How would you tell your friend that if they moved to New York, you might visit them? If you lived here, I would stop by. This means that I believe it's unlikely that you will live here, but it's still a possibility. If you do move here, then I would stop by. On the other hand, what if your friend already decided to live in California and that no matter what, they will never live in New York? How would you change the sentence? If you had lived here, I would have stopped by. With this, we're saying that your friend's decision to live in California happened in the past and is final. We're now imagining what things would be like if they didn't make that decision. How about if you want to ask someone about the things they might cook if they did not have to work tonight, which is still in the future? What would you cook if you had the night off? Notice again how in a question would and the subject switch places. Also, night off is a common way of saying that you don't have to work this evening. You could also say that I have the day off or I have the weekend off as well, depending on what times you are free. In the last question, we asked what you would cook if you had the night off, which means that it was something that could still happen, even if unlikely, because it was in the future. Instead, what if I was asking about yesterday night, when I know you did work, but I still want to know what would have happened if you didn't? What would you have cooked if you had had the night off? Of course, to avoid the had repetition, we'd most likely say, if you'd had the night off. Quick note, a lot of times us Americans get pretty sloppy with this particular construction, and instead of using had in the if part, we'll just use the simple past. If you sent me an email, I would have read it. This still means that you did not send it to me, and I'm imagining what I would have done if you did. If you're ever confused, just look at the would to see if it's there with have. If it is, then we're probably talking about something that did not happen in the past. The next usage of would in this category is probably the trickiest of them all. Here is when we use it to talk about possible or fake situations where we can imagine what they would be like. Let's look at some examples. If your sister asked you to go to Ireland with her, how might you respond? Want to come with me to Ireland? Really? That would be awesome. Here we are simply imagining this thing that might happen, going to Ireland, and what things will be like. They would be awesome. Next, let's say the hypothetical situation is registering for a class that you want to take. There is something stopping you, though. What might you say? I would sign up for the class, but I have to work. Here you are imagining your actions in a hypothetical world where you don't have to work. Now let's take a look at this sentence. Do you think it's correct or incorrect? The answer is it depends on the context. When you add the would in here, it makes the listener feel like this is a hypothetical situation. You would like to read, but what? What's stopping you? If you are simply saying what you like to do, then would doesn't make sense here. On the other hand, if someone had just asked you, if you didn't have kids, what would you do with your free time? Then this could be a perfectly valid response. Similarly, if we say she would love this book, then we're making this into a hypothetical. She doesn't actually love it yet because maybe she hasn't seen it. It's still something that can happen though. How would we change this to mean that it's a hypothetical situation that did not happen or is impossible? She would have loved this book. By adding the have, we're now saying that for some reason this isn't possible. Maybe you're talking about someone who died, so they can't actually love it. The last of the hypothetical usages is to talk about things you wish were different, maybe because you're annoyed or impatient. Let's say you are sick of having to work late on Fridays. How can you express this wish with would? I wish my boss would let me go home early on Fridays. I wish plus would plus a base verb lets people know that you are frustrated with the situation and you wish it was different. How about this one, where you are annoyed someone doesn't visit you enough? I wish you would visit me more often. It's annoying me that you don't visit enough. Side note, a common point of confusion is trying to do the same thing with hope instead of wish. We typically don't say would with hope in the present tense though, because with hope you're talking about something you want, not really a hypothetical situation. With that in mind, you've got two choices. Either say, I hope you will visit me more often, or just, I hope you visit me more often, or I hoped you would visit me more often, which is just the past tense way of saying this like the examples we saw earlier in the video. The third group is probably the easiest of the three because all we're doing here is using would to soften our language. We can form more polite requests, we can give our opinions without sounding too judgmental, or we can give advice in a more indirect way that sounds less like a command and more like a suggestion. Instead of telling someone to come inside, how would you make this request more polite? Would you come inside? We change it from a command into a question and start it with would. Now, can you think of a way to give your opinion about your boss without being so direct? What do you think of the new boss? I would think he'd be smarter. Instead of just saying he's dumb, we say we would think he would be the opposite, but he's not. In other words, we're turning our opinion into a hypothetical situation. Or this one, how could you state your opinion about a class without being so direct? I would have thought the class would be more helpful. You've probably noticed a pattern by now. Since we turned our opinion into a hypothetical situation that happened in the past, we say would have, plus a past participle, thought in this case, which says that in the past, hypothetically, you imagined the class was going to be more helpful, but in reality, it wasn't. In the case of advice, we can also soften our suggestions to be more polite and not sound like we are commanding someone to do something. For example, if your coworker complained that John is being very rude, you could say, tell him to leave. But this sounds pretty blunt or direct. It comes off as if you are annoyed with them complaining. How can you be more polite? I would tell him to leave. You can imagine there's an if I were you at the end of this. I would tell him to leave if I were you. This is much more gentle and makes it seem like you are empathizing with their situation. I've got some good news. We've made it through the three major categories. I've got some more good news. The miscellaneous stuff is pretty easy to understand. There's only two uses here. One is to simply use would to ask the reason why something happened, and the other is to express your desires. You can ask, why would he lie to me, to figure out what reason he has to lie. If you use I or we in the question, it's a way to tell the listener that you have no reason to do something. If I say, why would I lie? This means I'm not lying. I have no reason to. Tell me what my reason would be. This last one I'm sure you know very well by now, but how do you say you have a desire to move to the US one day? I would like to move to the US one day. Would is a huge topic, and you're not going to master a word with so many usages after watching just one video. Now that you know the theory, however, we need to practice. Start collecting examples from what you see in real life, and try to use them as often as possible to really internalize everything. We'll start with a little practice now as a review. Does would fit in this standalone sentence? No, it sounds kind of awkward because it makes us feel like this is hypothetical, but we're not clarifying why it is hypothetical. Instead, without any other context, saying something like, I hope I can count on your support with this, makes more sense as a standalone statement. How would you say that someone refused to listen to advice? She wouldn't listen to anybody's advice. Does would belong in this sentence? No, it doesn't. Since we're using hope, we typically don't use would in the present tense. Instead, you can say, I hope nobody gets bored with my stories, or I hope nobody will get bored with my stories. If somebody asked you how you might describe yourself in an interview, how does this sentence change? This is how I would describe myself in that hypothetical situation. Last one. How can you make this opinion a little more polite? I would expect it to be shorter. Here, since we're not using an offensive opinion like fat, ugly, rude, it's not necessary to flip shorter into something else, so we can just add would and call it a day. You now have everything you need to make sense of the world of would that you see in videos, read in books, or hear in podcasts. The rest is up to you. When you encounter would in an interesting sentence in the wild, especially if it confuses you slightly, write it down, add it to your collection, and see if you can figure out which one of these categories it fits into. If you like this video and want more, be sure to click subscribe and head over to deliberateenglish.com, where you can receive even more tips, tricks, and advice for speaking fluent English and understanding native speakers. See you later.